This is the ultimate guide to male psychology after a breakup. So we're going to be talking today about all the insights that I and my team have learned in the past decade that apply to men as a whole psychologically that you might not hear typically elsewhere. I'm also going to be talking about ideas like the self-reliance aspect, the avoidant psyche, understanding trigger points, why you really need to stop expecting men to reach out to you after a breakup, and really the major differences between men and women after a breakup. So in 1996, psychologist Ronald Levin started studying the ideal of masculinity. So he posits that there are like 8 core concepts that make up the idea of masculinity. There's emotional restriction, avoidance of femininity, a focus on toughness and aggression, self-reliance, achievement, rationality, objectification of sleeping together, and homophobia. Quite restrictive, wouldn't you say? But what I'm interested here is the self-reliance, because it's something that I see as a core component that keeps coming up time and time again in the post-breakup period. You see, our internal research has consistently shown that the clients that hire us have typically avoidant exes. I actually did a poll in our Facebook group last year where I asked, hey, what is the core attachment style that you would classify your ex as? And overwhelmingly, most of our clients said that their ex had avoidant or fearful avoidant tendencies. Now, this is important for our discussion because one of the most common traits of an avoidant is that they are fiercely independent. In other words, self-reliance is one of the things that they pride themselves on. And for the most part, it's something that everyone should have a certain amount of, but where it gets men in trouble is in relationships. Often relationships are about sharing reliance. An ideal relationship would probably be one where you could actually rely on the other person. Of course, relying on someone else requires you to be vulnerable, and that's where most men get freaked out, especially if the man is an avoidant. So let's talk a little bit about that, the male avoidant psyche. But what does that mean? They usually fall victim to the following 3 concepts. Number 1, they struggle in moments with being vulnerable and sharing feelings. Number 2, they criticize others who are vulnerable and feel an internal shame because they themselves struggle with vulnerability. So it's kind of a weird mirror concept where someone else they see who is vulnerable, they criticize them because they feel bad that they cannot be that vulnerable. They're very big on independent behavior and self-sufficiency. Big shocker here. So avoidants are typically trying to reconcile this weird paradox. They want to receive love, but they don't want to let anyone close enough to give them that love. So their solution is they avoid. And that brings us to breakups. What better breeding ground is there for avoidant behavior than the amount of emotion and vulnerability that goes into a breakup? For the past few months, I've relentlessly been throwing this graphic, which you should see on your screen right now, in my clients' faces. I had many different variations of what I call this: the avoidant, anxious, self-fulfilling cycle, a self-fulfilling cycle, a relationship death wheel. It's all the same concept. It's essentially the relationship prison that most avoidants will find themselves in from start to finish. And there are 8 stages to it. They start out seeking love. They find you. They convince themselves that their troubles are over. They start noticing some worrying things. Usually this is anxious behavior or a threat to their independence. They contemplate leaving. They actually leave. They're happy that they left. Then they start to grow lonely. Then they start to go depressed, which leads them right back to the beginning, wanting someone to love them. And again and again and again and again and again, the wheel rolls around, crushing everything and everyone in its path. They can't escape it. They try to. It's impossible. But really, what we're interested in is this part of the graphic right here, stage 3, noticing some worrying things. And this is really where the concept of trigger points becomes important. So what are trigger points? Well, if you haven't really been introduced to our coaching yet, I'd actually like to turn your attention there for a brief moment because I have a bit of news. In a month, we're going to have a new addition to our coaching family. Shauna Nicole, who's been with us for the better part of 5 years, is going to transition into being a coach for the X recovery program. Anyways, yesterday I'm on the phone with her and I'm actually training her, trying to show her like, hey, these are the types of questions people ask. Here's how you answer them. I want to see how you do. And what was interesting is we went to our private Facebook support group and just started randomly pulling questions from that. And an interesting question flew across our desk. It went something like this. My ex broke up with me. He's avoidant. I don't understand why he doesn't get freaked out by something as simple as meeting my parents, but he gets freaked out when I even talk about the idea of doing things together in the future. Not doing them, but talking about the idea of doing them. Quick sidebar here. I looked everywhere to find an exact post for this article so that I could put it up at the screen and show you, but I couldn't find it. So it's lost amongst the sea of posts in our Facebook group. You're just going to have to take my word for it. But anyways, here's the point. I think this is relevant because it's a direct example of the concept of trigger points. Now, what's a trigger point? Well, in this context, a trigger point is anything that will trigger an ex's avoidant side. And generally speaking, with avoidant men, it's any type of threat to their independence or self-reliance. So things like ring shopping, moving in together, you becoming pregnant, taking a trip together, getting engaged, entering into a relationship with them. You get the idea. For some avoidants, entering into a relationship is a trigger point. And therein lies the most interesting fact with regards to trigger points. Every avoidant is different with what threatens them. In other words, there's a different threshold that each person has that's unique to them. We know from experience that one avoidant can be cool with the idea of taking a trip together for the weekend, while another will get completely set off by it. The theme is always the same, though. Any perceived threat of their self-reliance has the potential of being a trigger point. Now, I'd like to switch gears here for a moment and talk a little bit about the expectations of men. Now, as you can imagine, we here on Ex-Boyfriend Recovery are ardent fans of the no contact rule. Now, the no contact rule refers to a period of time where you cut off all conceivable communication with an ex after a breakup. Now, most of our clients expect that when they use the no contact rule on their exes are going to come beg for them back or reach out to them at the very least. But our research has shown that that isn't the case at all. According to a poll done in 2020 by us, 62% of our clients said that their exes did not reach out to them at all during no contact. They were the ones that had to reach out first. This makes sense as it tracks with what we know about avoidance, which most of our clients' exes are. According to Free to Attach, one of the foremost authorities on avoidant research, often avoidants won't initiate contact with their exes, and they rarely unilaterally initiate reuniting because it creates uncomfortable feelings of vulnerability, and they can feel they don't know how to go about fixing things. Yet perhaps the most interesting paradox about avoidance is that this period where they avoid you doesn't really last forever. With enough time, they start painting you as the phantom ex. That still doesn't mean they'll reach out to you, but they employ selective memory and start remembering the good times and forgetting the bad times. Once again, pulling from Free to Attach, avoidants are free to long for an ex once that person is unavailable out of the relationship and typically out of contact, so they are untouched by the actual engagement and their deactivation systems aren't triggered, revealing their long suppressed attachment and switching their operating attachment wound from a fear of engulfment to a fear of abandonment. But the key here is time. You need to give a man enough time to get to this place emotionally where they think you have moved on, and then they will allow themselves time to fawn over you from afar. That doesn't mean they're going to reach out to you, but that means that if you end up reaching out to them, they'll be a lot more likely to respond to you because they've painted you a little bit differently in their minds. Of course, most of our clients don't ever allow that much time to go by because it's scary and it's at odds with their own anxious attachment styles, but that's a whole different topic. But really, I think it all boils down to understanding the major differences between how men and women handle breakups. Now, I've touched on this in depth in many articles before, but I figured it's worth repeating here. In 2015, Binghamton University started looking at the differences between how men and women handle breakups. They found that women tend to be more negatively affected by breakups, reporting higher levels of both physical and emotional pain. Women tended to recover more fully and came out emotionally stronger. Men, on the other hand, never fully recover. They simply move on. Now, what does that mean? Men simply move on. I think it's a reference to the fact that most men never deal with the breakup. They're happy to avoid it or simply use another person to distract themselves from the complicated feelings associated with it. Men report feelings of anger and engage in more self-destructive behaviors than women. Women, in comparison, frequently feel more depressed and participate in more social, affiliative behaviors than men. Women's behaviors could be argued to be more constructive strategies as a result of their tendency to preserve relationships, whereas men choose destructive strategies for maintaining their own self-esteem. It's not that men don't feel a breakup. It's that most try to prevent themselves from feeling it because it hurts that much. Now, just because I'm talking about it here doesn't necessarily mean that your ex-boyfriend is falling victim to this. Remember, there are exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, I've found that stereotypes tend to be true when it comes to breakups. So what's the big takeaway from this? Well, I think in general, men are avoiders when it comes to the complicated emotional resonance of breakups. They want to avoid the pain rather than face the pain. That doesn't necessarily mean that your ex is avoiding the pain. Remember, not every ex is avoidant, but those that are a lot more likely to avoid pain than face pain.